Have you ever wondered what secrets lie beneath the cemetery grounds? Grave diggers spend their nights among the dead, and some of them have witnessed things that defy explanation. From eerie whispers in the wind to shadowy figures lurking among the tombstones, their stories will send shivers down your spine. In today's video, we're diving into the chilling world of real-life horror stories told by those who work closest to the dead. These are not just ghost stories. These are first-hand encounters with the unknown. Turn off the lights, grab a blanket, and prepare yourself for some of the creepiest tales you'll ever hear. Because the graveyard never sleeps. Let's begin. My name is Marcus, and I work as a grave digger at a quaint cemetery in the countryside. At 47 years old, this job has become an integral part of my life. What began almost by accident has grown into a routine filled with respect and care for those who rest here. While working in a cemetery might feel unsettling to some, for me, it is a place of tranquility. There's a unique beauty in the stillness, the gentle rustling of the wind among the trees, and the comforting thought that, in the end, all differences disappear. The cemetery isn't large or particularly beautiful, with its simple arrangement of tombstones, many of which lean or are covered in moss. It's surrounded by tall trees, whose deep roots sometimes create challenges, displacing the soil and cracking some of the more delicate graves. Yet, it's this connection between humanity and nature that gives the place an enduring sense of time. Recently, the local council decided to invest in renovations to fix the damage caused by the roots. It was arduous work that required patience and a sense of detachment, as digging near tombstones often unearthed small remnants of history. A worn button, a dried flower, pieces of shattered marble. On this particular day, we were addressing one of the cemetery's oldest trees, a majestic fig tree whose roots stretched like fingers deep into the earth. I was using a hoe to clear one of the larger roots. I felt the blade hit something solid. It wasn't a stone. I was sure of that. Years of experience had taught me to recognize the difference. Intrigued, I began to dig carefully, removing soil and moss until something came into view. A small headstone. It was nearly completely obscured, as if nature had tried to conceal it. After clearing it with my hands, I could make out the inscription, though it was partially worn away by time. Sophia Adams, 1910 to 1916, Our Little Star. I froze for a moment, staring at those words. It was a child's grave, a girl who had passed away at just 6 years old. A mix of sadness and unease washed over me, tightening my chest. Working in this place had taught me that every tombstone holds a story, but this one felt forgotten. Why was it hidden? Who was Sophia Adams? And why did no one care for her resting place? I spent the rest of the day with these questions weighing on my mind. After finishing my work, I went to speak with Ibrahim, the cemetery's oldest caretaker. Ibrahim was something of a legend, a 70-year-old man who seemed to know every part of this place. I asked him if he had any information about Sophia. He scratched his head thoughtfully before responding, "That grave must be really old, Marcus. Back then, records weren't kept as well as they are now. Many families moved away or disappeared over time. It's likely that no one remembers her anymore." His answer left me feeling unsettled. I had seen many neglected graves, but something about that headstone disturbed me in a different way in the days that followed. Every time I walked by the area where the gravestone had been uncovered, I felt an unsettling sensation. The air felt colder there, even on warm autumn days, and when the wind blew, it created a strange sound as it rustled through the trees, echoing faintly in a surreal manner. I tried to dismiss these feelings as mere figments of my imagination, but at night, those sounds replayed in my mind, making it hard to sleep. My nights became increasingly restless. I had always been a deep sleeper, but since I found Sophia's gravestone, my dreams had become fragmented and troubled. Most often, they were disjointed images. A fig tree swaying in the breeze, a foggy cemetery, and at times, a young girl with chestnut hair braided into two plaits, dressed in a simple white gown. She never spoke. She just gazed at me with sorrowful eyes as if she was waiting for something from me. At work, the discomfort only intensified. Each time I neared that spot, the air felt denser, and the sounds of the wind seemed to morph into hushed whispers. Initially, I thought it was just my imagination, but it remained consistent, occurring in the same place each time. Eventually, I decided to look deeper into it. The cemetery had a small office where historical records were kept. Alex often expressed his distrust of the paperwork, believing that most records prior to the 1950s were chaotic or incomplete. Still, I figured it was worth a shot. I spent hours rummaging through boxes of old files. The documents were delicate, yellowed with time, and the handwriting was hard to read. I discovered records of births, deaths, and transfers of remains to different cemeteries. There were even letters from family members requesting the upkeep of their loved ones' graves. However, no matter how extensively I searched, there was absolutely no mention of Sophia. It's as if she had never existed. This only fueled my curiosity. Who had laid that child to rest, and why were there no records of her? I decided to consult the oldest residents in the area, those who might have heard tales about families living here in the early 20th century. My first visit was to Mrs. Rosa, an 82-year-old woman who lived a few blocks from the cemetery. She was known for her sharp memory and her passion for old stories. When I brought up Sophia, her expression shifted. Sophia? No, I don't recall any girl by that name. But back then, many children didn't survive fever, pneumonia, you know how it was. Maybe she was just one of those forgotten souls, she said. I left Mrs. Rose's home with more questions than before. I visited several people, but no one seemed to know anything about Sophia Adams. It was as if the past had enveloped her, concealing her story from everyone. That night, I had another dream, and this time it was more vivid. I found myself in the cemetery, standing next to the olive tree. Sophia was there, but something was different. She was pointing at the tombstone, as if trying to show me something. As I approached, I noticed a broken wooden cross partially buried in the ground. I woke with my heart racing, a sense of urgency buzzing in my mind. The next morning, I went to the tombstone at dawn and began to dig around it, hoping to uncover a clue. After some time, I unearthed fragments of decayed wood buried in the soil, remnants of an old cross that likely marked the spot where Sophia had been laid to rest. Seeing those pieces only unsettled me further. Why had no one cared for this? Feeling the weight of unfulfilled responsibility, I knew I had to act. Though there was no information available about Sophia, I couldn't dismiss the feeling that she was asking for help. I bought a simple wooden cross and carefully carved her name into it with a pocket knife. As I worked on the cross, I noticed something peculiar. The muffled laughter and whispers in the wind that had haunted me for days began to fade. The air felt calmer, almost serene, as if I was finally on the right track. That afternoon, with the newly crafted cross in hand, I returned to the cemetery. The sun hung low in the sky, casting hues of orange and purple across the horizon. The place was quiet, as usual, but this time the silence felt more welcoming. Less oppressive. I approached the location where Sophia Adams' grave had been discovered and inhaled deeply. I gently placed the cross next to the headstone, pressing it firmly into the earth. I had carved her name just as it was inscribed on the old stone, but I included one additional phrase, "Never forgotten." Though it was a simple act, it held significant meaning. As I secured the cross, I murmured a prayer. "Sophia Adam, may you find peace, and may your memory be honored." Once I completed this, there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere. The wind, which had carried soft whispers and distant laughter, fell silent. The trees remained motionless, and the weight that had burdened me for weeks seemed to lift, as if the entire cemetery had exhaled in relief. I lingered there for some time, sitting beside the headstone and reflecting on the moment. For the first time, I felt a deep connection to this site. Being a gravedigger had always seemed like a mechanical task to me, something I performed with respect but little emotional engagement. Yet in that instant, I grasped the true significance of my role. It was not merely about maintaining graves or keeping the grounds tidy. It was also about ensuring that no one would be forgotten, and that every story had a final chapter worthy of remembrance. In the days that followed, the cemetery returned to its usual peaceful state. The fig tree, which had once made me uneasy, now felt like a quiet guardian of the place. I began to visit Sophia Adams' grave regularly, leaving small flowers or simply spending a few moments in silent reflection. However, one last surprise awaited me. One day, while tidying up the area around her grave, I noticed something shimmering among the roots of the fig tree. It was a small, old locket, covered in dirt. As I opened it gently, I was taken aback to find a photograph inside. A picture of a little girl with brown hair tied in braids, wearing a simple handmade dress and smiling shyly. On the other side of the locket was an almost unreadable inscription that read, "Forever our light, Sophia Adams." The locket was the missing piece of the puzzle, proving that at one time, Sophia had been deeply loved. Perhaps her family had moved away or could not maintain her grave, but that didn't lessen the affection they held for her. I decided to place the locket at the base of the cross, burying it in a small patch of soil as if leaving her one final gift. That night, I had another dream, but this one felt different. In the dream, Sophia was no longer sad. Instead, she was running joyfully through the cemetery, playing beneath the trees, her shy smile replaced with pure happiness. I woke up feeling a tranquility I hadn't experienced in weeks. Even though I might never uncover all the details about Sophia Adams, I know I did everything possible to honor her memory. A cemetery is filled with unfinished stories, but sometimes a small gesture is all it takes to provide them with a dignified conclusion. The cemetery returned to its peaceful routine, and I resumed my daily tasks with a renewed sense of purpose. Occasionally, I would stop by Sophia's grave to leave a flower or simply stand in silence. Her headstone, once hidden and neglected, now stood marked by a simple wooden cross bearing her name, a silent testament that someone remembered her. One day, As I worked in a remote corner of the cemetery, a young couple approached me. They had come to visit a relative's grave, but the woman seemed curious about the cross with the name Sophia Adams engraved upon it. "Was she your relative?" she asked. I hesitated for a moment but then smiled. "Not by blood, but in a way, yes. She's part of this place, and I take care of her now." The woman nodded, seeming to understand. After they left, I realized that Sophia's story could inspire others to reflect on the lives buried here, to remember the forgotten and honor their memories, even if just for a moment. To this day, I often think of Sophia Adams. Her image, captured in that locket and imprinted in my dreams, remains with me. I may never know why her grave was neglected or why no one remembered her, but I do know this. For a brief moment in time, her story touched mine, and through that connection, she will never be forgotten. If you ever visit a cemetery and feel drawn to an overgrown corner or an abandoned grave, pay attention. There might be someone waiting to be remembered, and perhaps you are the one who can give their story its final chapter. I never imagined that a wake would leave such a profound impact on me. I grew up in a small town in the United States where death was seen as a natural part of life, and wakes were commonplace. Families would hold them at home, surrounded by relatives and friends who would pray mournfully for the soul of the departed. I had been to several wakes and found them all quite similar, until the day little Noah passed away. Noah was only 7 years old, living in a humble home at the end of a dusty street on the other side of town. He was a lively boy, always racing through the fields with endless enthusiasm. But life can be harsh, and death often arrives unexpectedly. One day, without any warning, Noah fell ill. No one could pinpoint the cause. His fever soared rapidly, and before anyone realized what was happening, he was gone. The news sent shockwaves through the entire town, but it hit his mother, Clara, the hardest. Clara was a strong woman, known for her resilience and unwavering love for her only child. Seeing her heartbroken was unbearable for everyone. Noah's wake was heart-wrenching. The small house was filled with neighbors and family, all crammed into a tiny living room where a white casket lay in the center, surrounded by candles and wilting flowers. The air was thick, not only with the oppressive heat, but also with the overwhelming sorrow that seemed to envelop everyone present. I arrived early, knowing it would be difficult to witness such a young child in this situation. But I wanted to offer my support to Clara, even though I barely knew her as I entered. The silence enveloped me first. Despite the crowd in the room, not a single word was uttered. It was an overwhelming quiet that was occasionally disturbed by the slow, heavy breaths of the Murs and the infrequent creaking of wooden chairs shifting under their weight. Everything was unfolding as anticipated for a wake, at least until after midnight. We were seated in the living room, reciting the rosary, when I perceived a sound from outside. It was faint, almost resembling a gentle wail, yet distinct enough to momentarily pull my attention away from the prayers. I looked around, searching for any reaction from others, but everyone appeared absorbed in their prayers. I reassured myself that it must have been a figment of my imagination. Moments later, the sound returned, this time longer and deeper, akin to someone experiencing immense pain. I lifted my gaze toward the window, which was only obscured by a thin curtain. Through the sheer white fabric, I saw a shadow, the outline of a woman standing right outside the window. Her head was lowered, and her shoulders shook as if she were silently weeping. I was unable to look away, while others in the room began to notice the figure as well. A few individuals rose and moved closer to the window for a clearer view. No one uttered a word, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. At last, one of the men present took the initiative to step outside and investigate. But as he opened the door, the woman had vanished. The shadow had disappeared completely, as if it had never existed at all. We returned to the rosary, though the mood had shifted. Nobody spoke of what had just occurred, yet all had witnessed it. I attempted to concentrate on the prayers, but the wails continued intermittently, always coming from outside, always faint, as though pleading for something. I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. I felt a sense of unease, realizing I wasn't the only one affected. Occasionally, someone would glance at the window, seemingly waiting for the mysterious figure to make another appearance. But she never did that night. The following day, the whole town gathered for Noah's burial. It felt as though everyone was compelled to be there to witness the event. However, the memory of the wake lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of the woman by the window or the haunting sound of the wails that still echoed in my ears. After the burial, I spoke with several neighbors, trying to make sense of the strange occurrences we had experienced. Nobody had a definitive explanation, yet many admitted to hearing the wails and seeing the shadowy figure of the woman outside the window. In the days that followed, the town attempted to resume normalcy, but the wake became the central topic of conversation. Whispers began circulating that the figure had been sighted again, this time in different areas of town. It was always the same, a woman dressed in white, crying silently before vanishing whenever anyone approached her. Some speculated that it was a bad omen, a forewarning of something worse to come. About a week later, Clara, Noah's mother, was seen at the local grocery store. Her face was ashen, and her eyes were hollow from constant weeping and fatigue. She confided to a neighbor that she had begun hearing the same wails at home, but they weren't just outside anymore. She claimed they emanated from Noah's room every night around the same time. The wails had started at the wake, and now they haunted her as if the woman were mourning for her son. Clara was on the brink of collapse, barely eating, unable to sleep, and her health was quickly deteriorating. The entire town was concerned for her, but nobody knew how to offer help. Some suggested she see a priest, pray harder, or seek forgiveness for any sins that might have caused her suffering. Some people believed that the woman in white signified that Noah's spirit had not found peace. One night, unable to quell my curiosity, I decided to visit Clara's house to see if what she had said was true. When I arrived, I found her sitting on the porch, pale and trembling. She barely acknowledged my presence but let me inside. The house was eerily quiet as I made my way down the hallway toward Noah's room. A strange weight settled in my chest. It wasn't quite fear, but something heavier and harder to define. I stood in the hallway listening, and then I heard it. The same low, sorrowful wail I had heard at the wake. It seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. I found myself frozen, paralyzed by the sound and the heavy feeling that accompanied it. It felt as if taking even a single step forward would cause the woman to appear right before me, weeping for a loss I couldn't comprehend. I left the house as fast as I could, unable to speak to Clara, not knowing what to say. Life in the town went on, But the story of the woman in white was never forgotten. Some claimed she was the spirit of a grieving mother who had lost her child in that very spot years ago, now wandering the streets in search of solace. Others thought she was a sign, a harbinger of something darker looming over us. Eventually, Clara moved away, unable to endure the nights filled with wails, and her departure brought some calm to the town. However, in my mind, the memories of Noah's wake, the wails, and the figure at the window still linger. I haven't returned to Noah's house since that night, but on quiet evenings when the town settles into silence, I sometimes feel as though something is watching from a distance, something that still mourns what it could not save. Working at a funeral home was never a path I envisioned for myself. It was a family business, something my father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had been involved in for generations. When my father fell ill, I had no choice but to step in. At first, I struggled to connect with the work. The rituals surrounding death, the paperwork, the body preparations felt so mechanical and distant. However, over time, my perspective began to shift in unexpected ways. Our funeral home, Smith & Sons, was located on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. It stood as a quiet establishment, enveloped by trees that cast long shadows as dusk approached. My mother used to say the funeral home was almost as old as the town itself. A sturdy brick building with tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch over passers-by. It all began one crisp autumn afternoon. The air was cool, and dry leaves crunched beneath my feet as I approached the entrance. That day, we received the body of an elderly woman from the town. It appeared to be a routine case without complications, or so I thought. When I entered the embalming room to initiate the process, an unusual occurrence took place. The typical silence of the room was shattered by a soft, low sound, almost a lament. Initially, I dismissed it, assuming it was just the wind rustling against the windows. However, I soon realized the sound was not coming from outside. It was much closer, as if someone nearby was softly crying. I glanced around in confusion. The room was empty except for the lifeless figure on the table. As I approached, I noticed something unusual. Two thin tears were gliding down the cheeks of the deceased woman. I froze, trying to comprehend what I was witnessing. I knew it was impossible for a body to produce tears. It defied biology. And yet, the droplets glistened in the muted light. I brushed them away, convincing myself it was merely residual moisture, and went back to my task. But that was just the beginning. In the following days, the situation intensified. It wasn't just one body that seemed to weep. Almost every night while I worked late in the embalming room, at least one body would display the same eerie phenomenon. Tears slowly flowing down their faces. Worse, it only ever happened at night, during the quietest hours of the funeral home. As time passed, a peculiar tension began to settle in the air, as though an unfamiliar energy was gathering within the establishment. I remember one particular night clearly. Earlier that day, we had received the body of a middle-aged man. Wanting to get ahead on my work, I decided to stay late. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the soft glow of a single lamp. As I worked, I sensed a presence nearby, despite knowing I was alone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made me uneasy. The man's body was crying. Not just subdued tears this time, but thick, heavy droplets streaming down his face. My breath became labored as I struggled to remain composed. I wiped the tears away, but when I turned back to gather my tools, a sound paralyzed me in place. A sob, a deep, guttural sound that filled the room. I spun around, searching for the source, but the body lay eerily still yet. Its visage now appeared altered. Its expression was nearly anguished, as if it were silently pleading for something I failed to comprehend. That night, I found it impossible to sleep, my thoughts consumed by the sight I had witnessed. I resolved to investigate the backgrounds of the deceased we received, discreetly inquiring with families about their loved ones. What I uncovered disturbed me greatly. Many of the departed had met their ends in ways that left their families unable to say a proper farewell. Some had died far from their homes, while others had passed in isolation. Their sorrow and guilt seemed to persist, manifesting in the remains entrusted to my care. The situation reached a climax a few weeks later when we received multiple bodies from a devastating car accident on the main highway, a calamity that rocked the entire town. That evening, I decided to examine the bodies before the embalming team commenced their work. Initially, everything appeared routine, but as I moved around the room, the weeping began anew. This time, it was not soft. It was loud, distinct, and emanating from several voices. I turned on all the lights, resolute in finding a logical explanation, and what I witnessed left me frozen in shock. Everyone in the room had tears streaming down their faces, with some seemingly shifting slightly, heads tilting or hands adjusting, as though they were trying to convey something beyond understanding. It was at that moment I understood this was not merely a coincidence or a physical peculiarity. I confided in my mother, who still managed parts of the business. However, she dismissed my experiences as merely stress and fatigue. Yet, something in her gaze indicated that she was not being completely honest. Finally, I resolved to consult with my grandmother, who had been part of the funeral home longer than anyone else. What she shared with me sent chills down my spine. Decades prior, my family had experienced similar occurrences. Bodies that wept and sobbed during the quiet hours of the night. This all began following the untimely death of a child who had not received a proper burial. Since then, certain corpses brought to the funeral home exhibited signs of lingering grief, as if attempting to express their sorrow. Equipped with this insight, I felt compelled to take action. I came to understand that the weeping bodies weren't merely a puzzle. They were a cry for assistance. My family had once conducted rituals to grant peace to these unsettled spirits, but over time, those traditions had faded away. That evening, I lit a candle and recited an ancient prayer my grandmother had taught me. I didn't anticipate success, yet I was open to trying anything. The following day, the funeral home was eerily tranquil. The bodies that had wept the previous night remained, dry of tears, their faces unchanged. The heavy atmosphere in the embalming room had dissipated. Over time, the phenomenon diminished, yet the experience has remained with me. Although the crying ceased, the feeling that there was a deep, mysterious bond connecting the dead to the living endured. Since that time, I have devoted myself to ensuring that every body is treated with the highest level of care and respect, recognizing that perhaps that is all they require to achieve peace. The funeral home is still in operation, and I continue my work, yet every night I enter the embalming room, I can't help but look at the dead's faces, searching for any indication of suffering. I am uncertain if I will ever fully come to terms with it, but one thing is clear. The deceased deserve rest, and sometimes they simply need someone to hear them, even amid the deepest silence of night. I was never a superstitious person. I grew up in a family that took a practical approach to death. My father used to tell me that only the living can hurt you, the dead cannot. He would constantly remind me that fear is a mental trick. For this reason, when I accepted a job at Riva Funeral Home in a small town, I assumed I was prepared for anything because I knew that death was just another part of life, and aside from the eerie silences and the strange feeling of being surrounded by lifeless bodies that once had stories, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The staff was courteous but kept their distance. Distant strange things were allegedly occurring at the funeral home, but I wrote them off as harmless practical jokes for new hires. The smell was subtle at first, a faint sweet aroma like flowers mixed with something richer, deeper. It was the kind of scent you'd expect from an expensive perfume, but it didn't belong in the sterile, meticulously cleaned environment of the embalming room. The first time I noticed the smell, I didn't expect anything unusual to happen. That changed in my second week. I didn't really notice it at first, but as the days went by, the scent became more pronounced and strong. What surprised me was that the scent only appeared when the room was empty, no flowers or bodies, and I began to wonder why it was there. When I casually asked my coworkers if they had noticed anything out of the ordinary, the majority of them shook their heads, but some reacted oddly, avoiding eye contact or abruptly shifting the topic. One or two of them appeared obviously uncomfortable, almost as if they didn't want to talk about it. One evening, while staying late to organize paperwork, the smell became so strong that it filled the entire room. Intrigued and a little uneasy, determined to locate the source, I went to the door of EMB Arming Room 2. There were no flowers, no cleaning supplies spilled, and nothing that could explain the overpowering scent. The room was empty. The stainless steel tables gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the air was cold from the hum of the refrigeration units. The sweet perfume had no logical source, but it was undeniably there. So late that night, I decided to look further, searching through the funeral home's archives for any clues that might explain its presence. That's when I came across a name. At first, I didn't think much of Maria Carter because she had passed away more than 10 years ago and her body had been embalmed in that exact room. But then I noticed the notes in her file. A heart attack was listed as the official cause of death for Maria's mysterious death at home, but strange annotations about how her family had insisted something felt off were found in the records. A quick internet search turned up even more disturbing information. When Maria was discovered, she was surrounded by dozens of broken perfume bottles. The next day, I cautiously mentioned Maria to one of the senior staff members, Alves, who had worked at Riva Funeral Home for decades and was known for his quiet demeanor. At first, he was reluctant to talk, brushing off my questions with evasive answers. But when I persisted, he finally confessed. It seemed as though she had desperately sprayed herself with her favorite scent repeatedly in her final moments. The connection was impossible to ignore. Alves recalled Maria's funeral with vivid detail, explaining how her perfume had been so potent at her wake that they had to repeatedly air out the room. He also acknowledged that in the weeks after her burial, a number of staff members claimed to have smelled the same scent in the embalming room as well, as if she had left something behind. Alves said in a low voice, "But some things are better left alone." His warning didn't stop me. On the contrary, It made me more obsessed with learning the truth about Maria's lingering presence. I stayed behind one night after everyone else had left. The perfume was still as strong as ever, almost suffocating, and I sat in the room waiting, but I wasn't sure why. As the hours went by, the air got heavier and the scent became stronger, and then I noticed a shadow flicker across the room. At first, I thought it was a reflection or a trick of the light on the metal surfaces, but as I turned to face it, the shadow seemed to shift, almost as if it was watching me. My heart was pounding, but I was immobile because I felt like I was being watched. What happened next was even stranger. A tiny antique perfume bottle caught my eye on one of the embalming tables. It hadn't been there before. It was elaborately made of fragile glass with a worn fabric atomizer, and I recognized it right away because it matched the description of Maria's perfume from old photos I had found. My hands trembled as I picked it up, and even though its contents were untouched, the scent was exactly the same as what had plagued the room for weeks. I put the bottle back on the table and walked out. Even though I made an effort to concentrate on my work, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that Maria's spirit was bound to that room and couldn't move on. So I avoided going into that room whenever I could. The perfume lingered like an unseen reminder of Maria's unsolved story. Nevertheless, the perfume would always find its way into the air like a whisper of something that had been left behind. And even now, years later, I am unable to explain what happened. It still haunts us and serves as a reminder that not all stories end in death. Even though Maria Montague has been buried, the scent and tenacity that bound her to this world endure. The job as a night watchman at Garza Funeral Home, just outside of a small town in Ohio, was just a way to make ends meet. It wasn't a place I ever thought I'd find myself in, and my duties were simple. Monitor the security cameras, make periodic rounds, and make sure everything stayed in order. It was a quiet, boring job, ideal for someone who wanted to keep to themselves, at least that's what I thought. The funeral home itself was an old building built decades ago, with thick walls and a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. It had no windows to the outside, which made the place feel even more cramped. The refrigeration room, where the bodies were kept cold until they were ready for their final arrangements, was by far the worst aspect, especially during the long, cold winter nights. The first time it happened, I was sitting in the tiny security booth, mindlessly looking at the monitors. It was one of those nights when the funeral home was completely deserted, with no services or staff, just me and the reverberating silence of the building. Suddenly, I heard a loud, sharp knock that sounded like it came from the refrigeration room. I froze for a second, thinking it must have been something. But then I heard it once more. A heavy, purposeful knock. I picked up my flashlight and tried to ignore the increasing uneasiness in my chest as I made my way to the refrigeration room. The air got colder as I got closer, and the chill went deeper than in the normally controlled setting. When I got there, I hesitated because the knocking had stopped and there was silence once more. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and saw rows of closed refrigeration units. I could hear the cooling system's faint hum and smell the sterile disinfectant as I walked through the room, making sure everything was secure. The man's body was perfectly still as it should have been, but something felt off his face. His hands appeared to have moved slightly since he had been placed there. I quickly made sure the door was locked tightly and left the room, returning to the booth. I tried to tell myself it was a mechanical failure or a fluke, but I knew deep down that it was not the case. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances got worse. Sometimes the doors to the units would open by themselves. The lights in the refrigeration room would flicker more frequently, and the knocks became loud bangs that reverberated through the halls. The body of a jar was inside, and no matter how many times I checked and rechecked the locks, I would always find them jarred. I hesitated before pulling the door fully open. The following night, it wasn't just the physical disruptions either. As I made my rounds through the halls, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I would feel the most intense sense of being watched, as if invisible eyes were watching me every step of the way, close to the refrigeration room. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, nothing was there. Even now, I can't fully explain what I experienced at Garza Funeral Home. Was it the spirits of the deceased restless and unable to move on? Or was it something darker connected to the building itself? Whatever it was, sometimes late at night I still think about the sound of those knocks, the flickering lights, and the open refrigeration doors, and I wonder if even now something is still there waiting in the cold. I couldn't stay there long enough, so I turned in my keys the following morning without even explaining why I had to leave.